A plane descends from the clouds as Chris struggles to keep herself together. She decides that this is the last time she and her husband, Tony, fly a plane, and his attempt to comfort her seems to be futile. But they manage to land on the ground and their kid, June, won't have to be an orphan anymore. They are both filmmakers going to an island named Faro, which used to be an inspiration for Ingmar Bergman. They hope to find something for their art there. An hour-and-a-half road trip is ahead of them, and the weird names of the towns, roads, and turns seem to be amusing. They use a ferry ramp to get to the island by sea, and come out of the car to enjoy the scenery of the northern land. There, Chris discovers that she left her sunglasses at the airport and Tony automatically gives her his. Their relationship seems to be firm and solid. They continue the rest of the way, driving through the island, until they finally see the woman that takes care of their future house, and realize that they reached their destination. Everything on this island seems to be filled with myths and legends of Bergman. The trail of the renowned director is everywhere, even in people who have a secret pact with Bergman, hiding away the places and confusing the visitors, as Ass says half-jokingly. There's even a Bergman's private screening room just across their house. Ass continues to show them around the house, ironically mentioning the big bedroom upstairs that was in the film called Marriage, the destroyer of millions of relationships. Finally, she leaves and Chris strolls around the house silently, as if to breathe the essence of it entirely as Tony settles down, chooses the side of the bed, and prepares his workplace. When he's done, he discovers that Chris is gone. Outside the house, he shouts out her name and sees her inside the mill. When Tony goes there, he finds Chris looking across the yard and into their house, deciding that this place is going to be her workplace. However, she can't help herself but feel that all the magnificence and perfection of this place might prove to be a distractor. It's almost intimidating for her to even sit at this desk, and so, Tony suggests that she write outside. A lot of people come here to throw themselves into the creative world. They are neither the first nor the last here. But this realization doesn't help, especially when they are going to sleep in that bedroom, the destroyer of marriages. They joke around this superstition, ironically deciding to sleep in separate beds and finally, go to the shore to address the water for help. The vastness of the drifting northern sea lightens their mood as Tony sucks in the salty air, while Chris jumps into the cold water headfirst. Later that day, they visit Hedda, the head of the Bergman Foundation, and Berit, who is in charge of the Bergman Week. Nobody on the surface of the earth knows more about Bergman than those people, and so, they sit down to eat and talk about some intricate details of the artist's life. Bergman, as it turns out, had 9 kids from 6 women and lived solely in the present. Therefore, he believed in ghosts rather than the god and was sure that his last wife Ingrid haunted his house after her passing. They continue their conversation inside, switching to a more practical subject. Bergman, as it turns out, was a great man for art, but a disaster for his family. The reasons are obvious. One cannot possibly manage that much work and a family of 9 kids at the same time. But Chris still feels ill about it. It's a shame to find out that your favorite artist was a dreadful man in real life. She asks for Tony's opinion, and with that, Hedda puts forward an idea that a woman wouldn't do the same thing. Chris, however, jokingly expresses her eagerness to have 9 kids with 5 different men, and Tony tries to bounce this playful exaggeration back with cynicism. That night, before she gets to bed, Chris seems particularly amused by something. Making her way towards the bed, she holds her laugh and finally guffaws. Tony doesn't even ask what she's laughing about. They both start to work the next day. Chris finally finds words to put down on the paper. Tony calls her. He's going to the Bergman Center. He asks her if she wants to go with him, but Chris prefers to stay and visit the center tomorrow. So he goes alone. Back in the mill, Chris's pen dies and she has to go back into the house for a refuel. On the second floor, she takes a new one from Tony's desk and sees his notebook, which is neatly lying in the middle of the desk. Chris takes it and surrenders to the urge to open it up. Flicking through the notebook, she discovers pages filled with words written in flawless calligraphy. But soon, she sees sketches, portraying something that she didn't expect. Odd and weirdly explicit fantasies that are so not coherent to the personality of the husband that she knows. She returns to her mill, thinking that maybe just like Bergman, her husband isolates his true self from his family as well. When he arrives back home, they ordinarily discuss his visit and watch a video of their child as if nothing has changed in Tony's absence. They visit Bergman's private screening room in the evening, trying to choose a film to see and eventually reach the conclusion. However, Chris, the man who's in charge of the prints, says that the film they chose isn't here, so he suggests another one, Cries and Whispers. After that, they take their seats in a hollow and empty session room and take a look at it. It's a horror movie without catharsis, as Chris says after they get back home. She can't help herself but feel like the same horror lies within her, threatening solitude and death. And so, as they prepare to go to sleep, their discussion continues. Bergman's movies are so dark and hopeless, they scarcely have any lightness in them. That director, despite living in this fairy tale of a land, chose to explore only violence and the hidden human nature. But, still one can't look away from them. Maybe, behind the curtains of beauty and harmony, lies something darker and deeper on this strange island. The next day, there's the premiere of his film. He's waiting outside until it's over since he can't stand watching his work, just as Bergman hated it. He is called to speak and answer some questions in front of the audience, and so he does. They start speaking about the importance of women in his films, and as he talks about how female main characters bring a sense of security to him, Chris remembers his drawings and exits the hall. She walks around the building and comes up to a store. She inspects a pair of sunglasses as the young man looks at her with a particular interest, as if Chris emanated some otherworldly energy. She turns back to purchase the sunglasses when he takes one last glance at her and leaves. Chris leaves too, and as she struggles to enter a churchyard a few minutes later, that exact man helps her find the way inside. So, the two of them meet by chance. His name is Hampus. As they talk, walking around and through the building, we get to know that he's doing a residency as well, working on his short graduation film. But he's leaving tomorrow since his grandfather is dying. They continue their way toward Bergman's grave, and we understand that Chris's work is not unfamiliar to Hampus. He and his ex-girlfriend watched it in an empty theater and got into a fight discussing it afterward. As they stand near the grave, they talk of Bergman's last years, and suddenly, she remembers that she has to do Bergman's safari with Tony. Now it's too late and she feels a little guilty. However, as it turns out, Hampus knows this island well, and he offers to take a look around the spots that are scarcely visited. Chris agrees abruptly. This is the last day he's here anyways. And so, as Tony comes out of the theater by a chorus of fans, asking for an autograph, Hampus and Chris are going to Olahau, drinking local cider as they drive through the island. Tony meets Francisco Molina, a teacher at the University of Barcelona. However, Chris is the one that he's looking for. He texts her and takes one last look around to see her until he enters the bus. Some intricate detail about Bergman's career is being spilled as Tony sits alone, looking outside the window aimlessly. Meanwhile, Chris and Hampus reach their destination. It's a sandy place in the middle of a man-made forest. Hampus tells her all about it, the historical and cultural aspects of this destination. Chris runs in the middle of the dune and lies on her back, saying that the sand makes her long for a nice sunny beach. And so, as Tony's solitary excursion continues, Chris texts him an apology when she and Hampus reach the southern empty beach. Snowballing with jellyfish in the water seems much more exciting than hearing countless pointless details of a director's life. Maybe, if Chris was with Tony, he would feel much more interested in the things that people talk about as they stroll around the island. But it all seems senseless for Tony. Their journeys seem to be somewhat similar. However, Chris's is far more immersing. She and Hampus buy lambskin as Tony and his group eat a lamb burger, while he can no longer stand any more discussion about the infamous director's life. In the following scene, Chris says goodbye to Hampus, thanks him for the day, and gets inside the house to see Tony, sitting on a sofa, reading something in solitude. She joins him on the sofa, apologizing for not being there. Tony lies about the experience, saying that it was pretty good. She tells him provokingly that she met a guy, an attractive student, whose clumsiness while talking about Bergman had its charm. Tony, as before, doesn't get upset. His voice only rings with biting irony, as he tries to stay and seem untouched by her adventures. The next day, both of them continue to work. However, Tony seems to be much more successful in that endeavor. He prints the scripts he has written, while all she can do inside her mill is to silence the clock to sit in complete silence. She goes back into the house and walks around his desk in her underwear, while Tony's swallowed by his work. Their intimacy seems to be shallow, so she decides to take a stroll around the island, hoping to find some inspiration. There's a house from one of Bergman's films that she wants to visit, so she rides the bike to a stone fence and continues the rest of the way on foot. However, she is unable to find it, as if the island itself has hidden the place deliberately. Fortunately, some locals walk by and Chris tries to ask them the location. But the legends turn out to be true. Bergman and the locals truly have a secret pact. They speak English, however, they avoid answering her question. She wants to continue the road, but a storm breaks and Chris has to go back home soaked in rainwater. Tony is still working when she gets back in from him. She gets to know that the house she was looking for doesn't exist. She would have known if she had come on the safari with him. They begin to prepare for dinner, talking about their work, and there Chris shares her inability and her frustration. She is failing to write her script, dragging along the pages in agony and wanting to even quit. She hopes to get encouragement from Tony, but the latter's words seem to do the opposite. Chris wants her husband to fully understand her, but Tony tells her to continue writing at first and then suggests taking a break. Nothing adds up and Chris has an impression that Tony just says the words and the communication between them is as superficial as it gets. Eventually, she quits trying to make him understand and asks about his work. Everything's working as clockwork for him. He writes about the invisible things that flow between a couple but doesn't share any details of a story, and this upsets her even more. He never discloses his stories in detail, while she tells him everything, and this fight eventually convinced Chris that the invisible things flowing between them in real life are left unnoticed by him. At night, while Tony reads his book in bed and ends his day cycle perfectly, she turns around to hide the tears, gathering in her eyes. Tony feels that something's not right, so he leaves his book and tries to get to the bottom of it. But she leaves his questions unanswered, and an understanding comes to her. The connection between them is fading. The next day, the two of them finally decide to take a walk together. There, Chris asks him if he wants to hear the story she wants to write, and we begin to see the scenes from her future movie. The movie begins on a ferry on the Baltic Sea. It's summer and a 28-year-old young woman is traveling from New York to Faro. Her name is Amy and she's the main character in the movie. She is going to the wedding of her friend Nicolette, who's marrying a Swede named Jonas. Amy's a director, therefore, her destination is of great value to her. Ingmar Bergman is a primary source of inspiration for her work, a way to channel herself. However, today, while crossing the sea, her mind is occupied by Joseph, a man she cannot let go. In Chris's mind, Joseph and Amy fell in love during their teenage years and they loved as passionately as teenagers do. However, again, just like teenagers do, they tore each other apart. Joseph left Amy when she turned 18. However, when they met again years later, their feelings were still there. So, now more mature, they began to see each other again, only to realize that it was too late. The timing between them was never right. Chris wants this story to be the last chapter of a series, filled with grief and sorrow, overshadowed by temporary moments of happiness. And so, Chris continues her story and we see that after a long time, the lovers meet again. Amy meets up with Nicolette's friends who are traveling to Faro by car. By a coincidence, Joseph did the same thing, so both of them end up in the backseat of a car, driven by strangers. Thanks to some telepathic agreement between the two, they act as if they scarcely know each other. They talk about their lives and ordinary things, as if they truly are strangers, and this unusual theatrical performance infuses her desire that much more. On a ferry, Joseph offers her to go to the upper deck and she follows him with a playful smile on her face. Looking at drifting waves down below, Joseph breaks the character first, saying that he saw her movie. She follows his lead, breaking her character too, and with witty hints of irony in between their lines, they talk about Amy's character, which seems to be inspired by Joseph. They spend the rest of the way as their willfully selected characters and finally arrive at Albatross, the hotel where the wedding is going to be held. They look for the groom and the bride, and after a chaotic and happy reuniting, Amy makes her way toward her cottage. It's a beautiful place altogether. In her bedroom, she takes out her dress, white at first glance, even though she thinks that it's more of a creamy color, and she inspects it, hanging down like a ticking bomb. In the following scene, she talks with Jonas, who used to spend his summer vacations here, in Faro. However, strangely and unlikely, he hates Bergman and all the fuss around the life and death and work of a seemingly legendary director. He's only a grumpy man, living in his fantasy for only himself, appreciated only by a few critics. For Bergman, everything was easier, in Jonas's opinion, and this whole image of an otherworldly artist is merely a delusion for him. But he still gives her the address of Bergman's home. Amy, tired of this conversation, stands up and goes for a smoke. She goes up to Nicolette and Joseph, and as he lights her cigarette, Amy brings forward the topic of her dress, calling it more beige rather than white. An awkward expression lands on Nicolette's face as she asks her if she has any other ones. Amy has, but they aren't as elegant, so Nicolette tells her that she will give her another one to wear. It's more of a decision rather than a suggestion, so the conversation ends abruptly. The party continues, but she seems to be more observant, rather than a participant in it. So, she stands up and goes to Joseph, who's a few feet away from the action, looking at the stars. She tells her that she's about to go home by bike, and so, Joseph follows her to it. The unquestionable connection between them is evident as they make their way down a dark and silent road, trying to hide away this bond with ironically flirtatious conversation. But in the end, Joseph decides to end this play. He pulls her close and kisses her briskly and fiercely. They break off and gravitate toward each other again, until in the end, they agree to meet each other tomorrow morning. So the story goes on as Tony and Chris stroll around across the country, to the shore. She calls him out for spacing out, but he denies it. And as they approach the water, she continues. The next day, after a painful night, very early in the morning, she visits Joseph. Both of them are free, so they go for a bike ride. They ride to Rockcore, a magnificent site, created by the sea, and then through a former fishing village. A day as peaceful as it gets. Until they start swimming, Joseph expresses his bittersweet fear that she will imprison his soul once again. But after Amy's reminder, he agrees that he decided to be with her. As they swim and get dressed again to lie beneath a single tree, away from the sun, words lose meaning and an eloquent silence falls between them. The day ends, they part ways, and that night it's all silence again. Amy hopes to hear from Joseph, but no words come, until the next morning at the wedding ceremony. She sits alone in the back, wearing some other dress, looking at Joseph as everyone chants. Suddenly, a tear rolls down her face. It might be that Joseph doesn't turn around to look at her, or the chanting, or the mystical atmosphere in the church, or maybe it's true that weddings are generally magically emotional. But, whatever the reason, she struggles to keep herself together as the ceremony starts. After the vows are exchanged and it's all done, all the guests go to a big house near a lake to celebrate the rest of the day. All, including Joseph, enjoy the party, but Amy is surrounded by strange grief. She sits alone by the fire in the next scene, when Joseph joins her, holding a bottle of champagne, justifying his absence. They dance, getting closer and closer to each other. And in the end, we see a happy expression on Amy's face. After the whole day of isolation, she vibrates with positive energy as they take their seats on the bus again. They sit together in silence when the bus stops, and the couple that brought them to the hotel invites both to the sauna by the sea. Amy and Joseph share a glance and follow them, wanting to continue the night. In the sauna, all speak Swedish and Amy sits alone, wondering what she can do. Eventually, she wordlessly exits into the morning and bolts towards the windy beach. She stands there alone for a while, laughing, until others follow her lead and all rush in the waves. After a while, they go back, and the couples part ways. Amy and Joseph go to her cottage, and as they kiss impatiently, we are transported back to Chris and Tony. His phone is ringing, so he leaves her to her thoughts for a moment. She imagines the scene in her mind, and it goes like this. After a long time of lovemaking, she wears her white dress for him as if she's trying to prove to him that she's worthy of commitment. They continue their lovemaking until an uninvited topic whispers itself toward them. Both are unfaithful toward their loved ones. Joseph loves Amy, but he loves another woman too, and he's building something with her. These words sting Amy fiercely. Why can't he build something with her? But the answer is even worse. It's life. Nothing turned out in their favor. Amy had a child with another man, and they drifted further and further away from each other as time went on. So, as a result, they are in love with other people now, but can't seem to forget each other still. This discussion kills her will to be intimate with him. But the temptation to burn these unpleasant and reluctant thoughts with him proves to be victorious. The next day, they are convinced that everybody knows about them. Amy doesn't care, but Joseph does. He's grown distant to the extent that she thinks that he's upset with her. But as he says, he's only upset at himself for betraying his girlfriend. After some time, he goes to his hotel and kisses her goodbye after this grim conversation. And so, Amy has left alone, waiting for him to change his mind. But after 2 hours, she can wait no longer. Amy rides her bike back to his suite but finds it empty. So she turns around and meets Hampus, who looks just like the real Hampus that Chris met, with only one difference: he's an alcoholic in the film. They play a game of Ludo. They have a great time, drinking vodka until Amy's mind turns to a feather, lightweight and easygoing to an extent that she can't even notice Joseph entering the cafe. On the last night, Nicolette, an amateur singer, performs in front of her friends. She starts singing a sad and melancholic song, the song that Amy needs to hear the least at the moment, so she swiftly leaves. She clears her mind in front of the drifting waves and gets back to the cafe. Near the entrance, she shares a cigarette with Joseph, who offers her to go to the beach with other people, but Amy doesn't wish to be in a group. She wants to be with him, and so she says plainly and decisively. But Joseph answers only with silence and follows her inside the cafe with the mask of a pleasantly smiling man. They stand by the bar, looking at a woman dancing passionately to Winner Takes It All by ABBA. She makes Amy join in. Losing herself in music, she doesn't notice Joseph living. But once she ascends the stage to continue her dance, she sees that he's gone. She rushes outside, trying to see him somewhere, but he's nowhere to be found. Eventually, a sudden burst of tears is about to cover her face from desperation, when she sees his message on her phone. It seems like he's gone on the beach with others and wants to meet her back in her room later. So Amy returns home quickly and waits for him, sitting in darkness alone, wearing the white dress again, but he doesn't come. The next morning, after a tiresome and suffering night, spent in anxious waiting, she visits his suite, but there's no sign of him anywhere there. So, she makes her way into the cafe, asking around for Joseph and finally, discovering that he's left. This news is like poison to her heart. She exits the building, takes her bike, and tries to digest it somehow, but to no avail. As she makes her way, fighting off the tears, she comes across Nicolette, and the sight of her friend helps only her tears. She starts sobbing, and Nicolette, knowing that it's about Joseph again, embraces her. And so, Amy gets back to her cottage as the hot restlessness in her is changed by cold sadness and desperation. And with that, we are transported back to Tony and Chris. She says that there are 3 endings inside her head. In the first, the story ends there. In the second one, she ends with the belt of her dress, but the third one is the most dramatic. There she tries to take her life in Bergman's windmill but fails. This is the place where she's stuck. She needs help, and the first person that she addresses is naturally her successful filmmaker husband. However, Tony tries to encourage her, saying that it depends on her if this story becomes a movie. He observes the details that are rather secondary for Chris, and at the end says that she only needs to find the ending. That's all. He makes it look as if the problem doesn't exist or it's only in her head. So this conversation doesn't ease the burden that she's carrying at all. That day, Tony takes their car and leaves to meet with his producers and bring back June, their child. So the whole house and the mill are left for her alone. She sits down at her desk to write an epilogue, and in the next scene, we see her getting out of bed and riding a bike to Lauder. a place where Bergman's house is. She takes out a piece of paper to check if she's going the right way, and we notice the paper. It looks exactly like the paper Amy used to note down the location of Bergman's house while talking to Jonas. And so, we understand that Amy and Chris are the same people, that she is telling her story through the perspective of a character. She finally sees her destination, gets around the stone walls of a house, and approaches the door. Once she's inside, she says hello, takes her shoes off, and silently walks around Bergman's house. In a big sunny library, she suddenly sees Hampus and gasps in surprise. As they hug each other and make their way toward Bergman's office, we get to know that he has returned from his grandfather's funeral. He turns the music off, saying that he came here to listen and fell asleep. Then they go to Ingrid's room and Hampus suggests that she stay here if she's looking for inspiration. Then he leaves to catch the ferry, so they hug each other once more. Chris sits on the bed, covered with lambskin, and falls asleep. In the following scene, it's nearly 5 o'clock. She has to leave soon before the alarm goes off. Suddenly we see a man, looking just like Joseph, standing in Ingrid's room. It seems like his gaze wakes Chris up, and we understand that his name is Anders. It seems like he's part of the crew. As she prepares to leave, Anders tells her that this is a perfect place for his character's scene. But as Chris says, there was no reason for Joseph to be here. Before she leaves, she shows him the library and the model of the Stockholm National Theatre, a magnificent object, portraying only one person, Ingrid Bergman, watching a movie. Next, we see a girl, looking just like Amy, joining a table where Anderson and Chris are sitting. It's an evening, but time flies by in a blink of an eye, and before we know it, it's the night the girl says goodbye to Anderson, who's going back to Stockholm with her wife and kid, and leaves. Then, Chris suggests playing one last game. They play a game of Ludo. They joke about her inability to lose and let things go, and Anderson starts preparing to leave. He stands up, takes his coat, and spreads his arms, surprised that she's not coming to say goodbye. She jokingly says that she's stuck, and with that, Anderson sits down in front of her. He takes her hand gently for a second, thanks her sincerely for everything, and leaves. The impression on her face tells us that, saying that she was stuck, she was only half joking. The next morning, as Anderson leaves Faro, Tony and their daughter get inside the ferry. We see that they have a great connection as they make their way to Chris. In front of the house, Tony tells her to run toward the mill. That's where she might find her. And so, as the little kid carries out the task, we are afraid for a moment. We don't know what kind of ending she came up with in the end. But, suddenly, we hear her voice, calling June from the window of the windmill. He comes down and firmly embraces her, looking at her husband as he makes his way toward her too. Her look is full of joy, but something else lies beneath that surface, something heavier and more sorrowful than happiness.